of building culture together, and that's exciting.
Inara, let's bridge to culture and reality, shall we? We have popular cultures, field music, podcast, and so on. They shape how people imagine space. You mentioned earlier sci-fi as well, or sci-fi movies. How important is cultural storytelling to real progress in space, in your opinion?
Paramount. There's no better word. The real connection, and especially sci-fi, right? Storytelling at our essence, we are the stories that we repeat. We're the stories that we live in. We're the stories that we hear, that we live. So, I would say sci-fi is a good example, right? I like to say the very first sci-fi happened when a cave person went outside and looked up at the stars and went, "What is that? What is going on?" And there was something just quite a little bit beyond their ability to comprehend or understand. And so in that moment where there's a gap, they start to draw on the walls, scribbling their ideas about what this might mean. In the abstract, it creates this beautiful void that has to be filled. And so culture starts to take shape around that. And we can talk about the constellations and the stories, right? Where we might see a star and understand that, plasma up there, someone else who doesn't understand it, we see creatures and stories around it. And then culture emerges from that. And there's an interconnection between that new culture that emerges and then doing, because someone goes, okay, you made this story. Now, what do we do with that story? How does that define us? Do we create religion or holidays around that? Does that tell us to go do something? Is there a new planting season? And we can see the same sort of relationship between Star Trek, for instance, and a lot of scientists that emerged. We had this golden age of space that we talked about that inspired people, the Sputnik era, I would call it. And then Star Trek emerges. And it dreams a little bit further. It goes, okay, what does this quite mean? Like, what would it be like to be up there? We don't quite know, but here's what I think. And so Gene Roddenberry is scribbling his heart's desires on the walls of our civilization. And we get from that culture shift, social shift. We get to talk about racialism. We get to talk about gender equality. We get to talk about political alignment. We get to talk about these kind of taboo subjects in a way that's in a new sort of setting where it's a little bit safer to talk about it. And then from that, so many scientists, so many astronauts took their inspiration and went, I want to make that a reality. So the stories really are what fuel us. They're what give us permission to decide how we shape our world. And so the more stories, the bigger stories we can tell, the more possibilities we can create and bring to fruition.
In your opinion, how can creator responsibility influence public engagement into it?
I think that starts at the basis, right? What I really have a peeve with is fear mongering. I work with a lot of amazing franchises. I've worked with the Orville cast and a lot of the Star Trek casts. Those are, kind of been my highlights. And it's hopeful and it's beautiful and it's fun. And I think we need more of that. Where I don't really like it so much is when I see this face-eating monster, alien kind of thing, the fear mongering. Really, I would say it's in line with like racial hate and racial fear mongering. So if I make a movie where it's like, okay, that person has a different color skin, they're going to get you and your children, people understand the framing of that is dangerous and damaging, and it's not so great. But we do the same thing now with the idea of aliens. If we meet aliens, I'd like to think that we have kind of a calm baseline to examine that relationship. But instead, right now, we have this preponderance of they're going to get you, they're going to eat your children, it's going to be terrible. And so that's unfortunately very popular. Those sort of stories are very popular. People, for whatever reason, like to be scared. But it's doing a lot of damage. So what we need is a sense of responsible story. And of course, make all the stories you want. Tell whatever stories you like. Tell the horror stories if you want to. But what I want to highlight and what I want to encourage is a sense of wonder and hopefulness in our sci-fi, because that's how we get the good stuff. No one ever sees a horror movie with a face-sucking monster and goes, you know what? I could build something amazing in space. So we need a kind of catalyzing sci-fi and catalyzing stories, and we need to do it in a concerted way. I would say as a national defense strategy, we should be funding more sci-fi. So a good example of this was Stargate. Stargate was actually funded by the Air Force. The Joint Chiefs of Staff oversaw the script writing. A lot of people don't realize this.